One of the characteristic things of the 2022 season is the bouncing action of the cars, the so-called porpoising. I'm joined by Craig Scarborough here to take a look at some of the data that's come out of the different races so far this season to understand it. But one of the first things I wanted to talk to you about was the origin of the word porpoising. It's often traced back to Mario Andretti testing a Lotus around Silverstone in the late 1970s. He said the car was bouncing down the straight like a porpoise. That's what most people report as being the origin, but I have done some reading up on this, and in early aviation, I think in the 1920s and 1930s, that term was also used for a sort of oscillation, aerodynamic oscillation of aircraft flying through the air. So that's what we're sort of looking at. But the first thing I wanted to take a look at with you, Craig, we've both been talking about this, is Charles Leclerc around Monaco and his porpoising coming out of the tunnel. Looking at some of the data from Monaco, just to show you the impact of porpoising on a driver. This is Charles Leclerc's data from free practice 2. And we kept on seeing him coming out of the tunnel just where the aerodynamic load started to build up across the Ferrari, and the car just started bouncing on the exit of the tunnel. Not normally a problem, but that's just at the breaking point, and it put off both Ferrari drivers and they kept on scooting on at the chicane. So porpoising is a big problem, not just for the fast cars, but also all the way through the field. However, the data we really wanted to look at, and we've been digging through this for the last few weeks, we had this great opportunity, didn't we, Craig, we had pre-season running in Barcelona, and then last week we had the Spanish Grand Prix in Barcelona, and that allowed us to evaluate the different teams and how they've developed through. And what we're looking at here on this graph is the amplitude versus the frequency. So just to clarify, amplitude is how hard your car porpoises, frequency is how quick that porpoising is going. Now, Craig, what are we seeing here?
So what you're seeing really is the change in position that the teams have had from that first test, where for most of us was the first time we'd seen porpoising actually in action, and certainly very visible. If you remember, Charles Leclerc had that fantastic slow-mo that we had. At that point, we were all a little bit surprised, as were the teams. We thought this would be very quickly sorted out, maybe not as quick as we thought. So now we're seeing where the teams have got to over that gap between the test and the race. And you can see some people have made progress, some haven't.
Yeah, what you really want to see is a trend like you see with Ferrari here, where they started off with a really aggressive porpoise, 1.5 G amplitude, but they've reduced that amplitude and the frequency have all just dropped down. It's porpoising faster, but not as hard, the Ferrari. And a lot of teams have found that same trend. They can reduce the aggressiveness of that porpoising, but it does porpoise slightly quicker. But that's less of an issue for the drivers. But you can see big changes, say, for Mercedes. They've really improved significantly, and we'll come back to that. The one team here seems to be a bit of an outlier, Haas. That's not gone so well for them, has it?
No, it hasn't. And again, I mean, Haas have been one of the teams that have really exhibited on the data porpoising more than any of us really expected. They've always been very high up at the charts there. So it's strange, but then they haven't done much to their car aerodynamically, possibly maybe not so much with the suspension either. So, you know, their problem's getting worse as they're trying to find more time out of the car until they bring updates. Everyone else has updated their car. So that could explain the crossover in the paths there.
Well, one of the things about Haas that is really odd is most teams have a fairly flat sort of porpoising characteristic through the Grand Prix, and you can see all of these wobbly lines through the middle of the screen, and those wobbly lines are just how severe, and you can see the data as the race goes on. Most teams suffer from roughly the same amount of porpoising, but look what happens when the fuel load on the Haas burns off. Their porpoising gets much, much worse, which I find a bit strange, because as the fuel load burns off, the car gets lighter, it should be picking up. So do you think this is something to do with the weight distribution of the Haas?
I mean, it could be. There's lots of factors that will come in to explain this, you know, whether you're in traffic, what's happening with your tyres, the way the car's set up. But certainly the Haas does seem to get worse, which suggests as the weight comes off, the car isn't as balanced as much as it was at the start of the race, and you know, absolutely seen there. Now, you've got to remember that the fuel tank ideally is positioned bang in the middle of the car on the centre of gravity, but that's not always the case given all the other links that you have to have for the monocoque and the gearbox and bits and pieces. So there will often be a little offset there, so the cars will change weight distribution slightly during the race, and I think that's possibly what's really explaining going on here.
And at first we thought maybe this was a one-off characteristic we saw in Bahrain, start of the season, the team finding their way. Yet we've seen the exact same characteristic in Saudi Arabia, we've seen it at other races through the season. Haas just seems to get worse as the race goes on, and they haven't really solved that. There's still updates to come on that car, but we're not sure. So let's have a look at Australia, because we started to see some different effects in Australia. Once again, you still see the Haas getting progressively worse through the race, and everybody else stays about the same. Mercedes gets a bit better as the fuel burns off. But look at this, Ferrari. That's really, really interesting, because once the safety car in that Grand Prix had gone away, we did see Charles Leclerc suddenly, aggressively, really bouncing down the straights, and nobody else was, because his car was exposed to clean air.
Yes. So again, lots of factors, but one of the factors would be how much downforce you're running, and balance with the fuel weight as well. When you're suddenly running much faster, you're getting more downforce, particularly in clean air, as you say, and that will just bring you close to that threshold where the porpoising kicks off. So again, there's a potential explanation here, but it's interesting to see also just the peakiness of some of these. Whereas the bottom half of the graph here, everyone seems to have it under control. Mercedes in particular go through kind of peaks and troughs of having it and not having it, which for the driver must be quite hard to be able to cope with it. You know, suddenly I'm getting it, whereas a few laps ago I wasn't.
Now, Mercedes, we've seen, have bought big updates to fight that porpoising characteristics. You can see how bad it is in this Grand Prix. Well, let's move on to the updated Mercedes in Barcelona. They had that big problem we saw back in Australia. Their porpoising was up, you know, nearly 1G in places. Here you go. But if you take a look down at the Spanish Grand Prix, Mercedes right down here at the bottom. It's really different, the effect that update has had. And we've actually seen that Mercedes development start with that new front wing end plate with those cutouts, and in Barcelona they were playing around with all sorts of different front wing solutions as well. So the development race is back on for Mercedes. So it's looking like they're back in the fight, and we could actually get a 3 or even 4-way fight at some tracks, with Alfa Romeo getting into the mix on some of the slower circuits for race wins. One team though, we did talk about it before, Alpine, and it's very clear where you look at the maximum porpoising amplitude, how aggressive that bouncing is. Alpine brought a big update to the last race in Spain, and well, it's fair to say it didn't have the desired effect, did it?
Well, it depends what the aim of the update was. I think it was a performance update. They haven't, you know, they've been kind of there or thereabouts with the porpoising throughout, but certainly Barcelona is something that just brings the worst out in that chassis in particular. We saw that through testing, and then, you know, through the races, everyone's ever so slightly different depending on the circuit and their setup. So they have got some homework to do, knowing the circuits that are coming up on the calendar in the next few races.
To take a little bit more of a detailed look at what's going on with Alpine, I thought we'd take a look at some of the lap outings from Barcelona. You've got the two Alpine drivers here. Esteban Ocon is the driver in red. Fernando Alonso is the driver in blue. Now, both have suffered significantly worse porpoising, but the cars seem to show quite different characteristics. Esteban Ocon had a slightly higher top speed than Fernando Alonso. You can see that down on your edge of the red line, sitting just slightly higher than that of Fernando Alonso. But he was fighting the car a lot in the final sector, and you can see that on the trace here, just the red lines just up and down. That's where he's just fighting the car like this. But the porpoising characteristics does seem to be very different for both drivers. And I looked at the car and I looked at the body parts, and I couldn't see anything obviously different car to car. So this must be a setup thing. So what sort of things can they be changing to have such a dramatic difference between the two?
Well, there's lots of things the driver will change in the setup of the car, particularly with the suspension. And then when you have someone like Alonso, who's obviously quite extreme with the setup on his car, so you can change the springs and the dampers, even ride height to how the driver likes the car to respond. And that will give you very different results. And it just shows the sort of knife edge that these cars are on, that a small change in setup or potentially following another car, being in headwind, tailwind, things like this, will bring a car that is otherwise handling well into porpoising and then back out again, and in slightly different ways. I mean, I noticed here Ocon had actually porpoising, but at a lower level for longer. Alonso only had it at the very end here. So it's all very different, and it must be very hard for the drivers to cope going from a good handling car to a porpoising car.
Well, that's something that Alpine, and every team actually, is going to have to look out for. Alpine are clearly going to have to develop it out of their chassis and aerodynamic design, but every team's going to have to keep an eye on how they develop their cars and make sure that they stay out of that porpoising region. It's going to be very interesting to see who manages it well and who manages it badly as the season goes on.